I wanted to just give you something here. I was excited when I was asked to speak on Joseph, because when it comes to the Bible characters and the stories in the Bible, he's definitely one of my favorites. I think David is my all-time favorite. I think Elisha and Elijah are probably next, but I love the story of Joseph. I love the way that he lived his life, and just the way that Bobby set this up, talking about leaving a legacy. A lot of what I want to share this morning with you guys is really the same thing, and it's kind of neat having my dad here. And we'll try to keep my composure and not get too emotional. I'm not a Bobby Basham. All right, so I won't get that excited per se, but I hope that my real goal for you is that you leave with something practical. I know most of you probably know this story inside and out, but I hope that you walk away just with an encouragement and something practical. It's similar to, for those of us that are married, it's good to remember your wedding vows, isn't it? And even what Bobby shared just about looking back and how that man's marriage was saved just by seeing the old, young love and seeing those pictures of them at a young age. I think it's important that sometimes we're reminded of just the basics. Sometimes the things that we already know, it's just a good reminder for each one of us. And so when I think about this Joseph and how he lived a life of integrity, and how we're challenged to live a life of integrity as men in today's society, I don't know about you, but it's difficult. It's very tough, because I've even seen in my life how the world has just gotten so much crazier. And you think about, some of you that are older than me, which, you think about what it was like as you were a child growing up. Now, my son is growing up with computers in his hands. I mean, I used to learn DOS, right? Come on. I mean, I learned how to type on a typewriter. I'm only 41. I mean, some of you were probably around when typewriters were invented. The world and society is changing. If you guys missed it, I do have a little handout. It's just a little sheet, but if you don't have a pen, you might not want one anyway. I do have a little sheet back there. It's good for tic-tac-toe and making paper airplanes. And at least it'll give you something to look at, to follow along with. But, society in this world is ever-changing. And I feel like getting worse as we go. I've talked to my church before about it, and if you think about it, just all you have to do is look at television shows. You think about I Love Lucy, right? They slept in separate beds. I mean, what? I mean, that's not why we Christians get married, is to sleep in separate beds, right? And so here they are in separate beds, and then you move to the Brady Bunch. And then you look at the Brady Bunch, and what happens? All of a sudden, they read in bed together. Scandalous, right? And then you think about some of the shows that we go to nowadays, and they've got all sorts of relationships and marriage issues and not even being married and what they'll show. And that's what our society becomes. And so us as men, to live with integrity, I think it takes a lot more. I think we're having to stand up in ways that we didn't have to even think about. I have to think about more with my 11-year-old than my dad ever had to worry about with me. And so I think it's even more important that we look at our lives and guard our hearts and try to think, how do we live a life of integrity? Joseph did it. And that's what I love about Joseph. Joseph did it. And you look at Joseph's life, you see how God blessed him at every stage, every way that he goes. And it starts out with his life at home. So this is when we first hear about Joseph, and it's Genesis 37. We don't have to read it all and everything, because you guys do know the stories. You can go back and do your homework and read this story just as a reminder. But Joseph, in this early part, this is really the only failure that I could pinpoint in Joseph's life, is early on, his primary failure. Joseph was the favorite, and we love to hate the favorite, don't we? Anybody else? I mean, that's why my brother and sister hate me, because I am the favorite. No, we love each other. But if you're not a Yankees fan or a Cowboys fan, you can't stand the favorite, right? You love to hate The favorite, and that's the natural thing for us. I mean, so when you think that there's somebody that is picked to win or something, we like rooting for the underdog. Joseph was the favorite in his family. And what happened is that, Joseph ended up having to struggle with pride because that was his probably only struggle. He struggled with this pride, and it's something that I think that each one of us as men, we struggle with. Even if we have a low self-esteem, there are ways in our life, if we're honest with ourselves, that we struggle with pride, where we think we're the best, we think we're untouchable, we think that we can conquer anything, we think that we can overcome any sin or anything like this, and we struggle with our own pride. And this is the one thing that kind of got Joseph in trouble, but it's not new in the Bible. Lucifer struggled with pride. Cain struggled with pride. Why didn't God, instead of just fixing it and giving God the right sacrifice and doing it the right way, caused him to murder his brother? Moses, even though he wrote down that he was, the most humble man in the world, Moses struggled with pride because it was out of pride that he struck the rock and disobeyed God's order to speak. But it was out of pride and anger and I'm done with these people, right? And then David, and Bobby talked about David's life, and David's pride is what led him to murder Bathsheba's husband. I don't want to get caught. I don't want anybody to find out. Brought him home, tried to get him to sleep with her when he didn't. He was trying to cover his tracks. Why do we cover our tracks? Except for pride. And it's even probably, if you back up a little bit, it's probably pride that got him in trouble with Bathsheba in the first place, thinking, I'm a king, I can have whoever I want. Call her here, right? And so, even if we go to look at the disciples' lives, we look at them and they're arguing who's the greatest in the kingdom, and they're sitting there bickering among themselves. You hear about squabbles with Peter and Paul and different things. You see, pride is really laced throughout the Bible, and it really covers the whole spectrum for each one of us as men. You see it happening. So this is the one failure point for Joseph, was life at home. He struggled with pride. And so Joseph is, starting out at home, probably with all these older brothers. I have my older brothers here. And you've got these older brothers, some of them are taller, some of them are hairier, some of them are stronger and better at one sport than the other and stuff. And then here comes Joseph, the youngest, and he's the favorite, right? So Joseph, out of self-preservation, probably had to have some sort of dignity and pride to dig into. And sometimes I think pride can manifest in our lives in a good way sometimes. It starts out as a good thing. You want to get your feet under you. You want to, stand up for yourself. You don't want to be bullied and just pushed over. And so you've got to learn to stand up for yourself. But then that same thing that helps keep us alive and going, when it switches and it crosses that line, it got him in trouble. He was honored over his brothers, and he rubbed it in, I think, like a spoiled brat. Just like what a little brother can do. I mean, there are probably things that I can say to my brother, you're the perfect example. JB's here. He's like, why did I come to my brother's thing? But he's leaving. But one of my favorite things to talk about my brothers and my relationship, we were never competitive. Just like Bobby was lying to you. We were definitely competitive. He's the firstborn, and I'm the next in line there, and 3 years younger. So we would play. He was always, faster than me and stuff. And I remember football games when, if I got to score a touchdown on him, I had to keep running after I scored the touchdown. He was like, hey, you scored. I was like, no, I gotta keep going. He's still chasing me. That's just the kind of relationship we had. But I do remember coming back from college, and we had a foot race in college, and I actually beat him in college one time. He's like, wow, you bastard. And I was like, it took like 18 years, but finally. But, Joseph struggled with this, and I think he really probably was a spoiled brat. But yet God spoke to him in a dream, 2 dreams. Can you imagine being told by your younger sibling, hey, I had a dream that y'all are going to bow down to me someday? What do you guys think about that? Like my coat? You know what I mean? He was milking it. He was rubbing it in. He was enjoying this, and he was telling his brothers and his parents, even to the point where his dad is just like, listen, what are you talking about? You're a little bit crazy. son, but yet his dad was the one that kind of tucked it away. He probably had zero modesty when he was sharing it. When I think about men, I think that's one thing we really aren't, is modest. You don't think of too many men and think of as modest, There was a joke, and I won't go into too much detail, but there was a email talking about the differences between men and women. And it was actually referring to men and women after or preparing for a shower. Okay, so when you're married and stuff, guys, we throw the towel over our shoulder and we're like, hey babe, how you doing? And the wife's like, can I get a little privacy please? Can you leave me alone? We're just made a little bit different. So modesty, typically as men, not something we're worried about, We're typically at the beach, we're like, yeah, I want that and a bag of chips. Let's just go. We're gonna go tubing or something. We don't care, right? And women are like, yeah, I'm not going to the beach today. I'm gonna, and it's just in our nature, typically, we're not that modest. And Joseph, I don't think, had any modesty in this situation. Of course, we know that this leads his brothers, just pushes them over the top where they're like, let's get rid of him. We're done with him. Think about how awful Joseph probably was and how much hatred they developed in their heart to push them to the limit, to sell their brother and get rid of him that way and concoct something. They were actually planning to kill him, and one of the brothers saved his life. God saved his life. And so this is the only failure that I could really pinpoint that I feel like Joseph really messed up. His life at home, he was filled with pride. And Joseph, in this situation, being sold, he learned humility. We must fight against our pride as men. We have to fight against our pride. It's not just coming naturally. We're not naturally modest people. We have to fight against our pride, and we have to recognize who we are. Joseph was taught a very difficult situation. Hopefully none of you were sold by your family. Hopefully none of you had to endure that. However, there are things in our life that happen where you just don't care. I think women, it's kind of like God's sense of humor, that the most modest of creations, that they have to be the ones birthing the children. Because all modesty goes out the window when a woman is giving birth, right? I don't care who you are, who sees what, get this baby out of me, right? And so, praise God that we do not, we've already learned our modest lesson, right? So we must fight against our pride. And so I'm going to ask you these questions, and you can write these down and answer them. I'm not looking for you to answer them right now to me, but what areas in your life are you still filled with pride? What areas in your life are you struggling with pride? Find them. Because I'm telling you right now that each one of us, we have areas, we have places that we struggle with pride. Secondly, I want to look at Joseph's life as a servant. So we know he gets sold. We know he heads to Potiphar's house in Genesis 39, 1 through 20. We don't really, I don't know about you, but I don't really, other than waiting tables, and I was a waiter for many years, I don't quite know what it's like to be a servant. And I think that's probably my best picture of service, is waiting on tables. It's actually a humbling thing to do. Yeah, it's nice to get a tip, but it's also awful to get stiffed by people when you get $2 an hour and they walk away and write, here's your tip, don't eat yellow snow, and they think they're so cute. It happens. It really does, and it's kind of sad. But to be a servant, I have no idea, but I would hope that we all have jobs or have had jobs, except for little else in there, other than your job's probably making your bed or whatever. But God blessed everything Joseph did. He blessed him. Don't you find that amazing? Because we just knew about Joseph in the home, prideful, sold by his family, really disrespected, and so there was a humbling that happened. And I think it's because Joseph learned to be humble that God started blessing him. Joseph learned a lesson that we all have to learn, that he learned that it wasn't his power, his strength, that he was just all that in a bag of chips. But he started working for God and realized, I'm placed in this situation. God spared my life, and here I am. What am I going to do? I got to make the best of it. And so I think it's because he learned humility, but I also think Joseph must have been a hard worker. I think Joseph was a hard worker. I think he did his very best. And so God used that hard work. He used that to really elevate him in Potiphar's house. And so Potiphar's house, he starts getting esteemed. He becomes, first place among all his workers. And so what do you think? I mean, we're men here. What do you think would be the first thing to sneak into Joseph's life when he becomes the coolest, best worker?
Pride.
Exactly. Right? You see how this is laced throughout this. God was teaching Joseph, breaking him down, trying to get him to a place where he could use him. We know the end of the story. We know how it works, but I want you to see how this is laced throughout it. Joseph's doing well, and that's when the enemy also wants to sneak in and destroy us. So Joseph's doing well with Potiphar. I mean, if we were to write the story, don't you see how Joseph could just kind of graduate from Potiphar, and Pharaoh's like, hey, you know what? I want that worker, and he steals him and brings him into the palace. And Joseph just moves straight from Potiphar's house into the palace because it's just an upgrade. And then he just, grows in Pharaoh's palace, and it could have happened that way, couldn't it have? But see, God was still working on Joseph, and he still had to break Joseph down a little bit. And so Potiphar's wife becomes the major temptation. He was doing well, and that's when the enemy blindsides us, when we just think, hey, I've got this, I'm doing well, and then enemy sneaks in. I imagine that she was probably attractive. They talk about Joseph being attractive, because nowhere in the Bible do I see that when she, comes to Joseph and everything, it says, and Joseph just didn't look at her because she was hideous. That's not Joseph's answer. He's just, that would not honor my boss. You're not mine. You're the only thing in his house that he's held from me that is not my possession. So he was bringing honor, but I believe that it was probably a very difficult situation. We know, guys, in this world that we're living in, that the temptation is there for us to see and look at whatever. Joseph's story would have been a lot different if he had given into the temptation when it first presented itself. And he was fighting it all along the way because he was ready for it. And so this old prideful Joseph might have reacted a little differently. Old prideful Joseph, when confronted with this, might have thought, you're right, I am pretty attractive. I am pretty good. I have been doing some crunches. You're right. Yeah, thank you. My arms are almost as big as my legs. You're right. And instead of reacting pridefully, Joseph knew, and I think had learned, that that was his weakness. And so because he knew of his weakness, he was able to withstand the trap of the enemy. He was able to avoid it. He was able to run away from it. So instead of acting pridefully, Joseph ran from the temptation. But God wasn't done with Joseph, and he obviously got caught. Joseph, worked hard at that job to bless somebody else. He did everything right. And here he is falsely accused. When things are going great, the enemy snuck in. And it's going to happen in our lives as men. It's happened in my life where I'm thinking, why are bad things happening? Why do we have to go through difficult situations? I'm not going to talk about this, but my child was born 3 months early. So he was only 26 weeker, my second child, Levi, and had a brain hemorrhage, had a lung hemorrhage, had heart surgeries, brain surgeries, all these things. Doctors predicted him not to live. He's alive. He has cerebral palsy, he has visual impairment, but he's alive. And, we rejoice with God, but you go through something like that, and even looking at my, 5-year-old now, and my heart breaking because, he can't keep his balance sometimes, or he falls over, or he, is going to special needs school and things. You wonder, why are we going through these things? But God's always teaching us, just like Joseph. God's always teaching us and working us because he's concerned about our end result. He's concerned about where we're going and that he has a plan for us. And so Joseph was willing to learn this. We need to work hard to honor God and be on guard for enemy traps. This is a fill in the blanker. So work hard to honor God and be on guard for enemy traps. So the question I want to ask you on this point is, how can you work harder to honor God? In what areas do you need to work harder to bring honor to God? Not necessarily your boss, not necessarily your wife, not necessarily your parents or your co-workers, or to impress your neighbors, but to bring glory and honor to God. How do you need to work harder? And what traps do you need to be ready for? What traps do you need to be on the lookout for? There's nothing worse than walking blind. And I mentioned my son and things like that. And he does trip over things. He doesn't see things. And it's very difficult, to watch him struggle. And I imagine like what it would be like walking around, looking through this. I would probably knock over my coffee. I would knock over things. I wouldn't see things that were in my path. And so we have to keep our spiritual eyes open to be able to see the obstructions that lie in front of us. Work hard to honor God and be on guard for enemy traps. So next, Joseph moves to prison. His life's getting better, isn't it? He goes from being with his family. Then he's a servant, probably in a pretty nice house. Potiphar sounded like a legit guy, and he had the hookup, And now he's in prison. I can't imagine that the prison was very good. I don't know what your stories are. I would pray that none of you had to ever endure prison or anything like that. And if you did, I'm so glad that God's redeeming your life and you're back with us. But we've watched enough movies and TV to know that prison is not a happy place. And it wouldn't be a fun place. And life in prison for Joseph, I'm sure that in Egypt it wasn't very nice. And although we aren't in prison, although we're not in a physical prison, I believe that all of us can live life feeling like we're in one. See, we get locked up by a lot of different things. We get locked up to sin, and we're in bondage to sin, maybe fear, worry, anxiety, depression. And this isn't really a laughing matter, but some of us probably have lived life once in a while thinking, I'm in bondage in my marriage or in my home or in my workplace. And these things can just kind of like feel like crushing on us. And I'm sure that this was another humbling time for Joseph. Can you imagine? I was just sold from my parents. What did I do? God, I honored you. I did everything right. Isn't this the perfect time for Joseph to just turn his back on God and say, forget this. I'm done with this serving God thing and honoring him. This is like, I'm going back to old Joseph, prideful Joseph. You see, we know that he didn't do that because God's blessing him even there. But I'm almost positive that Joseph had moments of struggling and questioning God. Because I know I have. And Joseph's human. He did it, but I know that he was human and I know that he struggled. You see, the enemy wants to bind you so that you feel helpless. He wants to control you. I imagine in the prison times, Joseph was wondering, why in the world is this happening, God? Why in the world did you let any of this happen? And why is it even worth serving you? Why is it, even something that I could do to even, what in the world? I would feel that way. Anybody with me? I hope you're with. I hope you get that, and I hope it brings perspective to each one of us. What did he do? Did he sulk? Did he say, woe is me? I just done with this? No. He didn't. Joseph lived his life still using his leadership skills that he learned in Potiphar's house. He used his leadership skills that he was trained in, probably in Potiphar's house, and he started leading the prison cell. And he started being an example of the prison cell to where once again, our Joseph that learned humility became first of the class. Even if it was in a prison cell, he's like, listen, I'm going to lead with excellence, and I don't have many people. It's not too hard to lead you guys in excellence here in the prison, but I'm going to still do my very best to honor God and lead with excellence. Too many times, if we're in a bad situation, boss, parent, spouse, job, finances, we use it as an excuse not to do our best. I had a rough upbringing. You don't know my dad. You know my dad. He's here. I'm role playing here. You don't know how hard it is to grow up without a dad. You don't know what it's like to grow up in the area that I lived in. You don't know what it's like. You don't know what it's like to be 5'7", slightly balding. You don't know what it's like to, have ACL knee surgery. Now I'm talking about myself. ACL knee surgery. We make excuses and think that then we're justified for how we respond. And our excuses keep us from acting the way that God wants us to as men. Joseph did his best living in an awful place he didn't even deserve. He didn't even deserve it. Falsely accused. If anybody had a reason to gripe, it was Joseph. here he was still in preparation by God and placed there by God for a purpose, and he still lived for God. We know that because of the way that he grew. God blessed his efforts, used him in the prison cell. We know about the dreams and the interpreting the dreams and everything. But here's what's crazy is that even after interpreting the dreams, being used by God, everything came true. Joseph's left there for 2 more years. Some of us in our lives, you feel stuck in prison. You're like, why am I still here? Why am I stuck here? God, I'm doing things for you. I'm serving for you, and I'm trying to do the right things. I'm reading the Bible, I'm praying and stuff, but yet I still feel stuck in prison. Don't let that keep you from being a man with integrity. Live your life strong wherever you are. Nothing is said of how Joseph lived in those 2 years. There's no description. There's no, and Joseph, prayed every day. Joseph did this. The only thing that I can tell you is that how he lived correctly is that when he was called, he was ready. Mm-hmm. When Joseph's name was called, he said, remember me. 2 years it took. But when his name was called, he lived his life so he was ready. And so my point there is live ready and willing to be used by God. So we've got life at home, life as a servant, life in prison. And the question I want to ask you after that is, are you in chains? What are the chains that bind you? What's the prison cell that you're stuck in? Because if you're doing anything for God, I'll tell you there's an enemy that's trying to put chains on you. He's trying to lock you up somehow. And sometimes through that back door, you never know. So what chains are binding you? And then I want you to believe. Are you believing for God's freedom? Even if you're waiting. Even if you're stuck in the 2 years, 5 years, 10 years of waiting. Are you waiting for God's freedom? Because it's on its way. And we have to trust as men, knowing that God has a plan for us. He created you for a purpose and a plan. And finally, we get to life in the palace. And that's something happy, right? This is the good part. It's like life in the palace. Genesis 41:16. 2 years later, Joseph replies to Pharaoh when he gets out. Listen to this. This is how I know Joseph lived ready. Pharaoh says, can you interpret this dream? Prideful Joseph. Joseph that struggled with this. Can you interpret this dream? Many of us will be, yes, I can. Do like a can or something. It's like, we would be like totally on it. We're like, oh yes, I can. Done it before, do it again. Right? Here's what Joseph says. I can't do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Joseph learned to point completely to God. It's not my ability. It's not my abilities that I've been blessed by God, and I'm going to do it because God's enabled me to do it. Joseph's life in the palace is exactly what he was destined for. That's part of God's plan the whole time. And if we backtrack, we say, God could have done it a different way. He could have done it an easier way, but it's exactly what Joseph needed to get to the place to be prepared for the palace. And when he got there, he was ready. It wasn't on his plan or timeline of goals or even on his radar. Do you think when Joseph was being thrown into a pit by his brothers that he said, I wonder if they're going to send me to Egypt and I'm going to become Pharaoh's number 2. Number 1. Pharaoh's number 1. Number 2 under Pharaoh. Was that part of Joseph's plan? I mean, do you think when he got to Potiphar's house that he was just like, oh, you know what? Potiphar, only be here for a little bit, man. I'm moving up in Egypt. I got plans. You see, sometimes our plans are so less than what God has planned. Sometimes our plans are so much less than what God has planned for us. He's got a palace plan for you. And you're wondering why you're going through the hurting situation. You're wondering why you're going through the brokenness. It's because God has a palace for you, and he's got a job for you to do that is greater than any prison cell that you're in, than any struggle and difficulty during your home, any difficulty that you have in your workplace and serving and working and struggling. God has something specific for you to do. It might seem insignificant to you. It might be, becoming president. I don't know what it is for you. You might be pastoring a small church in Winchester. But God has something for each one of us. Joseph was ready, and that's what I love about it. Young Joseph at home was not ready to give credit to God. Young Joseph at home was ready to take the credit for himself. God walks us through this journey of life, blessing us, teaching us, allowing good things and bad things for our betterment. For all of us to get ready for our palace moment. It's preparation. Bobby, talked about physical attributes and things like that. If you are wanting to go for a race, guess what you're going to do? You're going to practice. If you want to sign up for a hot dog eating contest, you're going to start practicing eating some hot dogs. Whatever it is, we're going to prepare and we're getting ready for what God's called us to do. And that's exactly what God's doing. Joseph remembered to stay humble. He had proven himself to run from temptation. And he showed he could serve God even in the darkest times in prison. And now he was used to save Egypt, save his family. And this is where the Israelites became the Israelites. A lot of times we look at it as like, but that enslaved them. It's what they needed. It's what the Israelites needed then, to see God's hand and his power. And you follow the Israelites, and you look at the Israelites in their life and how they trust and walk away from God, and trust and walk away from God, and it mirrors us in our life. Yep. And God walks you through the highs and lows, breaks us down to get us to the place where he can use us in our palace moments. So, final point there, I want you to remember God's lesson while you're in the palace. Because if pride had snuck back in, I don't think Joseph would have been successful. I don't think he would have been the man that God called him to be. So are you ready for the palace? That's my final question. Are you ready for your palace? As men, we're called to live ready. We've got a higher calling than just taking care of ourselves. Whether you have a family or not, I want to challenge you to live with integrity, because there are others that are looking to you. I know I have 2 boys that look to me, and I have a wife that looks to me. I also have a church. But in your situation, your circle of friends and people that you know, who's looking to you? If you're not ready for it, you're not living with integrity. If we as men aren't living with integrity, then we're leading a bunch of others in the wrong path and giving them the wrong example. And they're going to be people that aren't free because of our lack of obedience. There are going to be people in our wake that aren't free or saved because of our lack of obedience. So I'd like to just close in a prayer here. I'm ending a little bit early. That's how I roll, guys. Father, I thank you for this time of just challenging us as men. And when you gave me this message, God, I know that it's been a challenge for me, and just I pray that each one of us would guard our hearts against the pride that sneaks up, the pride where we can handle it, the pride where we don't need accountability, we don't need to confess our sins, we don't need help overcoming our sin or our difficulties. God, forgive us for that pride. Help us, God, to learn humility without having to have you just break us down. Help us, God, to humble ourselves by choice instead of having to live a life like Joseph that just had to keep getting broken down. God, I pray that you would help us to serve well as men, whether it's our church, at home, in the workplace, that we would serve to honor you, that we would love our wives with all of our heart and mind and strength, even when our wife isn't around, that we would say the right things and look at the right things and protect our eyes and run from temptation. Help us, Lord, to honor you and be on guard for the enemy's traps. Father, I pray that each man here would be free from the bondage that might be in their life. God, that they would recognize that there is bondage in their life and that you are wanting to free them. That you're wanting to release them from their prison cell. As long as they're in the prison, they can't enter into the palace. And God, I pray that you would break chains in this room and help us, God, to be free from the things that would just enslave us. God, I pray that you would help us as men to live ready live willing to be used by our God. And Father, I pray that there would be men that are living in the palace, guarding against attack, learning all the previous lessons that they've learned, God. And I pray that we would see lives freed in the name of Jesus. That there would be spouses that don't know Jesus come to know who Jesus is and come to a saving knowledge of Jesus because of the way that men in this room live their lives. That there would be brothers and sisters and siblings and co-workers and others that come to know Christ because we're men that live with integrity. I pray that we would point and give all the glory to you. And Father, I pray that you would just bless us. Help us to live for you with excellence and live our lives with integrity. We love you and ask this in Jesus' name.